Our first speaker, would you please welcome from the New Zealand Institute, Rick Boven.
Thank you, good morning, and thank you for having me along this morning. I've spent about 25 years as a management consultant actually working for businesses and governments in many sectors and in many countries. And so my expertise is not really in economics so much as it is in understanding what makes businesses work. And you'll see a bit of a bias in that to the way I approach the issues that I think we have as a country here in New Zealand. Right. A little bit of historical context, which I'm sure we all understand, but it's actually quite important. New Zealand got rich by exporting agricultural commodities to the UK, and then when that was over, we diversified the economy and we reformed the economy. And those were very necessary steps. We grew our export volumes because we needed the foreign exchange in order to ensure that we could import the cars and computers and things that we wanted to import. But we didn't get very good export values because our competitive positions were not strong, and we ended up with relatively low productivity and relatively low incomes. This is all against a context in which the global economy has now grown very large relative to the environment. That results in scarcities, and we're seeing price rises across a huge range of commodities, not just in the last few years, but over the last decade. We're seeing climate change, and we're seeing ecosystems damaged. So the issue in New Zealand is not just that we need to recover our economy, but also we need to restructure our economy and the way we go about doing business in order to deal with this new global environment that we're operating in. So the challenge for us now is to pursue high-quality economic growth, build technological capability, increase resource use efficiency, protect and restore the environment, and ensure supply chain security. I'm going to focus only on the first of those, which is high-quality economic growth, but the others are also important. We've heard a lot this morning about the macroeconomy. If you don't get the macroeconomy right, it's hard to do well. But the macroeconomy doesn't create wealth. What creates wealth is the real economy. And the real economy involves, for a small nation that must trade, making and selling things. And in New Zealand, we tend to make and sell three things. Agriculture, our traditional strength. Manufacturing, which is in the process, continuing process, of transforming from being protected and relatively low calibre to being internationally exposed and competing in global markets. And what this chart shows is the average productivity for these three export sectors in New Zealand. It was a little bit of a surprise to us because what it shows is that none of these sectors have sufficiently high productivity to create wealth, the kind of wealth that the leading countries in the OECD are earning these days. On the right-hand side there, you can see the average private sector productivity for Australia, $74 against our roughly $40. The domestic economy is roughly the same, roughly $40 on average. So we've got a pretty fundamental issue in the real economy. And the question is, why is that? I think one of the reasons is that we don't really quite have a clear and shared understanding of the position that we're in. We tend to believe that agriculture and tourism have competitive advantage. My perspective on that is that they have comparative advantage. They're sensible things for New Zealand to do. They don't actually have competitive advantage. We compete with low labour cost countries. We're a long way away. We have to do a lot of transformation. Tourism jobs are relatively low paid anyway. Second misconception or misunderstanding is that our agricultural productivity has grown. Over decades, we have dramatically improved our efficiency at the farm gate. But that's not how you measure productivity. You measure productivity in terms of what you get for what you make. And that hasn't been growing. So let's not kid ourselves. The third misunderstanding is that the commodity performance drives economic performance. When dairy prices and commodity prices go up, the economy goes up. When dairy prices and commodity prices go down, the economy goes down. It seems to make sense, doesn't it? But imagine that you had a trend that was going down, and you had that up and down going over the top of it. You would come to the conclusion, the easy conclusion, that it's the cycle that's important and not the trend. And we haven't quite distinguished in our thinking about our economy the difference between what drives the cycle and what drives the trend. And our challenge is to ensure that we improve the trend. The next misunderstanding is that it will all be okay because with all these emerging difficulties in the world, shortages of land, growing population, demand for protein in developing countries, we're all going to get rich. The issue with that is that the contribution of these agricultural commodities are making to New Zealand is insufficiently large, so that when you multiply the prices that you need to get in order to bring us to parity with Australia, say, as an example of a rich country, you have to multiply by 3 or 4 times. We've already seen roughly a doubling in 10 years, and we're seeing the wobbles that are occurring in the Middle East and North Africa, which are the countries that are most exposed to food scarcity. And as it goes up 2 or 3 or 4 times, we're going to find that that expands in the world and becomes a great difficulty. That is not a solution for New Zealand. It's not a place we want to go. And the last misunderstanding is that manufacturing is a poor performer. And indeed, on average, it is. But within manufacturing, there are some very strong segments that are very high productivity. If you're an agricultural country, I mean, New Zealand's really the only agricultural economy that tries to aspire to be rich. Australia is a resource-based economy these days, minerals and so on. The others don't do it that way. What they do is they sell manufactures and other high value-added goods. And the illustration, you probably will see this slide by now, but I do want to show it. This is exports per capita for New Zealand against Denmark. And you can see they're almost identical in terms of their food and beverage exports per capita, food and agriculture per capita, beverages similar. But Denmark has a large manufacturing export activity that New Zealand doesn't have. And that's the difference between the two countries, in terms of Denmark being one of the wealthy countries in the world and New Zealand being one of the less wealthy countries in the world. Can we do what Denmark does? Sorry, I jumped ahead there. I've got a slide missing, sorry. There are many opportunities to grow high value-added differentiated exports in New Zealand. Value-added food businesses that are anchored here, niche manufacturing, including some high-tech, where a small exporter can be a world leader, avoiding the scale disadvantage. ICT, where distance and scale are less important barriers to success. And in those industries, if we lift our capability, that helps all of our other businesses as well. The service sector, where we can access world-class technology, and New Zealand labour costs are relatively low. We've already got successes in engineering and education, financial and medical, and these high value activities. The top 100 technology-oriented companies in New Zealand export around $5 billion per annum. They have high average productivity. There's no reason why we can't grow these. But we do have a challenge, and it's a very, very important challenge, because where we come from is as domestic producers of commodity goods. And if you produce a commodity, all you have to do is produce it to a quality standard, bulk it up into a ton or a bale or some sort of readily describable class, find a customer and agree a price. And the transaction takes place at the border. If you're thinking about those higher value added things, whether they're manufactured or services, you've got a fundamentally different sales problem. The sales problem transforms itself into something that has to happen in the other country. And that's where we don't do so well. If you want to sell differentiated goods and services into international markets, you have to shift not only the kinds of products and services that you produce, but also the way you go about selling those, marketing them, developing businesses, integrating forward into the distribution channels. And the Management Matters study that Reba mentioned or discussed didn't cover marketing. And I think it would have shown that our marketing would fall well below par as well. At best, it's extremely good on average, not good enough to be competitive in international markets. So, what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do is really acknowledge where it is that we start from. We're a small, isolated, poorly connected country with commodity producers and a transactional approach to business. We have insufficient skills and insufficient capital. Those are generalisations. In the best instances, that's not true. But unfortunately, the best is not the average. We find ourselves at risk of being consigned to the periphery of the world. As a producer of commodities, great place to visit, a safe haven, potentially, and be famous for the All Blacks. I expect more of our children can name All Blacks than they can successful entrepreneurs. But we do have the opportunity to become one of the world's leading economies. We have the resources, we have the environment, we have low population density, we have access to technologies and to markets, and we have evidence of progress. But all we have is a lot of rhetoric. And what we need to do is convert that rhetoric to action. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that a lot of small changes will make a difference, except for one thing. When we started our research on the economy, we had a look to see how countries moved the dial. And for every country that had moved the dial, that had seriously accelerated its economic growth rate, it had done something big. It had made a move. We won't do it, I think, by making a lot of small moves. We need to make some big moves. In our case, it's the enablers that are holding us back. And we've heard earlier this morning about how the macroeconomic enablers are holding us back from transforming our economy. I want to highlight another set of enablers, more the kind of things that management consultants identify, and some specific proposals to accelerate the growth of high-value exporting businesses. The first of these is to establish at scale national institutes of excellence, growing competences in science, in engineering, in operations, in marketing and entrepreneurship. We've made that point, and we do see change in that direction, but it's change at a pretty slow pace, and it's not especially aggressive, and there's no great sense of mission around it. We need to ensure that tertiary education institutions are producing the mix of skills that we need, the science, the engineering, technologists, international business and entrepreneurs. You can't do a full-time course in entrepreneurship, in international entrepreneurship in New Zealand. And yet we expect that's going to be our future, I would hope. We need to incentivise investment in high-value exports instead of in residential and rural assets. That point's been made before this morning. And we need to ensure there are sufficient internationally connected capital-providing institutions providing funding for growing high-value exporters. And finally, we need to assist our small firms more. They are small. It is very difficult what they're trying to do. And most of the management teams in those firms are in the management teams because they're good at the functional things that have led them to be there. They're good at accounting, or they're good at product development, or they're good at sales, or something like that. Most of them don't have management training, which comes back again to that management issue. So, where is the source of all of these things? Why are these things opportunities? Well, I think it comes back to the same discussion that we had earlier about the macroeconomy, focused on the macroeconomy. It's governments. Governments are responsible for all of these things. Not just this government, but the previous government as well. They're the ones who have to act. And finally, because 10's better than 5, and because I want to be a little bit complete, I'm going to list some other important economic goals that should be used to complement those I've suggested. Reduce the effect of exchange rate volatility on exporters. I'm a bit agnostic as to how we do that, but it is a very important issue. Make sure we've got solid infrastructure, balance the government's books, reduce the aggregate debt, use our youth. We're wasting our youth. 45% of our unemployed are youth. That's not a great way to start. And lift the productivity of the domestic industry so we can release capital and talent for export growth. I'll make one final comment on industry policy. There are countries that have done very well with industry policy. There are two issues that are raised here about industry policy. I think we should pursue it. Not everyone does. There are two issues that are raised. First is we don't know how to do it. My answer to that is if we don't know how to do it, let's move over and get some people who do know how to do it. And the second is the issue that, we're cousins, and there is a risk with that you end up with too much influence from the interest groups. If you are going to grow industry policy, then you need to be very sure that you are vigilant, and that means media and culture and institutions, to make sure that everyone who's involved is acting properly and in the interests of the country.